Wi-Fi in schools is safe. True or false? We don't believe in putting antennas near schools, so why are we so willing to put antennas inside schools? That's right, Wi-Fi routers are microwave antennas. One type of microwave radiation we are all familiar with is the microwave oven. What do microwave ovens and Wi-Fi routers have in common, and how do they differ? Both use the same frequency and both have the same wavelength. This is the ideal condition for heating water. They differ in that Wi-Fi routers use a much lower intensity of radiation. The radiation is not contained. It consists of pulsed waves rather than continuous waves. More about that later. And the Wi-Fi router is on all the time. For these three reasons, we should be concerned about placing Wi-Fi routers inside schools and inside our home. Let's have a microwave cooking lesson. We can bake a potato in a microwave oven set at 100% power within 6 minutes. If we reduce the power to 50%, it will take twice as long, or 12 minutes, to bake the potato. This is called the time-weighted exposure. Now let's replace the potato with students and the microwave oven with a school. Students in school are exposed to microwave radiation for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 40 weeks each year. That comes to 1,200 hours a year of exposure. After 10 years, they're exposed to microwave radiation for 12,000 hours. Let's put this 12,000 hours into perspective. The Interphone study was published in 2010. This study showed that adults who used a cell phone for more than 1,640 hours over a 10-year period had a 40% increased risk of developing a brain tumor called a glioma. How does this exposure compare to Wi-Fi in schools? Interesting. And yet we are told that Wi-Fi in schools is safe? Here we have the electromagnetic spectrum that organizes the electromagnetic energy according to frequency and wavelength, with low frequencies at the bottom and high frequencies at the top of this chart. Scientists have given names to different parts of the spectrum that have similar characteristics. At the bottom, we have extremely low-frequency electromagnetic fields. Then we have a band called radio frequency radiation that overlaps with microwaves and radar. Wi-Fi fits into this category at 2.4 gigahertz. At even higher frequencies, we have ionizing radiation that is known to be carcinogenic. Both radio frequency and extremely low frequency fields are classified as possibly carcinogenic by the World Health Organization. Light is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and microwave radiation has many of the same characteristics as light. For example, light can be transmitted through windows, reflected or focused by mirrors and glass, absorbed by dark colors. Similarly, microwaves can be transmitted through buildings, reflected and focused by metal, and they can be absorbed by water and fat. That is why we can cook a potato in a microwave oven, but we cannot cook dry rice. True or false? Levels of microwave radiation in a room are uniform. False. A filing cabinet, as well as other metal objects, can either decrease or increase our exposure to Wi-Fi radiation, depending on its location relative to you and the router. Taking a measurement at the middle of the room will not give the same reading as taking a measurement near a metal object, near your computer, or near the router. Metal objects on or in your body will also reflect, block, or focus microwave radiation. This is why sensitive people are unable to wear jewelry. A student with a mouthful of braces standing near a router is likely to have higher radiation exposure in the head than a student not wearing braces. True or false? Natural sources of radio waves are much stronger than man-made sources, so we have nothing to worry about. False. This graph shows altitude above sea level. Ionizing radiation is largely absorbed by the upper atmosphere, and very little reaches the Earth's surface. The same is true for infrared radiation. Both light and radio frequency radiation reaches the Earth's surface. So we are exposed to radio frequencies coming from outer space, but these sources are very weak. That is why we need large radio telescopes to detect the energy. These microwaves are like whispers from outer space. A cell phone within 10 kilometers of one of these receivers is similar to a shout and would interfere with a signal coming from space. That is why radio telescopes often have an exclusion zone surrounding them to minimize this type of man-made interference. True or false? Our exposure to microwaves is increasing exponentially. True. Much of the early research with microwaves was kept top secret. In 1939, we had the first radar exposure of the military. In 1967, the radar range, or microwave oven, was introduced. In 1984, we were introduced to cell phones and the cellular antenna system. In 2000, we had our first exposure to campus-wide Wi-Fi. In 2004, we had the first WiMAX operating. This is now called LTE, an acronym for long-term evolution, also for long-term exposure. In 2008, schools began to install Wi-Fi routers. In 2010, smart meters began to be placed on homes to record electricity, water, and gas consumption. So most of our exposure to radio frequency microwaves dates back about 30 years. Here are some of the major changes in our exposure. In the past, our exposure was intermittent. Today, it is constant. The radiation is no longer limited to military bases and airports. Today, we have transmitters inside our home. In the past, exposure was limited to a few occupations. Today, infants and children are exposed. We can use the flood analogy to describe the increasing levels of microwave radiation. Low levels have no effect, but as the level rises, a few people are adversely affected. Those below the line have become electrically hypersensitive. As the level continues to increase, more people will become adversely affected. True or false? Wi-Fi radiation is pulsed, and pulsed radiation is more harmful. True. We don't know all the reasons for this, but one reason is the way it's measured. Here we have radiation that is not pulsed. The maximum value and the average value are quite similar. With pulsed radiation, the maximum or peak value is much higher than the average value. And since many health authorities measure only average values, they underestimate exposure considerably. The intensity of radio frequency radiation can be measured using power density. Guidelines in various countries differ orders of magnitude, or by 100,000 units. This is unheard of for chemical toxicants and for ionizing radiation, where standards globally are quite similar. The worst guidelines are in the UK, but Canada and the United States are not far behind. Guidelines in Russia and Switzerland are at least 100 times more protective. These guidelines are not effective because adverse effects occur at much lower levels of exposure, as shown in red. True or false? Industrial strength Wi-Fi is used in schools. True. Indeed, this is how some companies advertise their powerful wireless routers. True or false? Wi-Fi base stations constantly emit radiation. True. Wi-Fi base stations or routers in the school have multiple antennas. These antennas emit a beacon signal. The routers are placed at various locations as shown in this floor plan. Each router emits microwave radiation that is always on. With multiple routers, the entire school is blanketed with microwave radiation. True or false? The highest exposure is at the computer and at the router. True. Once the computer is disconnected from the internet, the only remaining radiation is from the router. So the placement of these routers is critical. They should be well marked in plain sight and as far away from people as possible. True or false? The more users uploading and downloading information from the internet, the higher the levels of radiation. True. And the closer students are to each other, the higher their exposure. True or false? Long-term, low-level exposure to microwaves harms rats. True. The U.S. Air Force completed a study in 1984 at a cost of $4.5 million. They exposed rats to pulsed radiation at 2,450 megahertz. This is the same frequency used for Wi-Fi. At levels well below federal guidelines for 21.5 hours daily for 25 months. The results were published in 1992 and became available on the internet in 2005. The results show that rats exposed to microwave radiation had more B cells and T cells. These cells are part of the immune system and become activated when the body detects unhealthy bacteria. The T cells alert the B cells that in turn produce antibodies to attack the bacteria. What is unusual is that this experiment was conducted under sterile conditions. That is one reason it cost so much money. Even more disturbing results were the effects on tumor growth. 3 types of tumors were identified in various organs: benign, primary, and metastatic tumors. A summary of the results are shown here in Table 2. What are the effects of long-term exposure to low levels of pulsed 2.45 gigahertz, also known as Wi-Fi radiation? A 16% increase in benign tumors, a 100% increase in metastatic tumors, a 260% increase in primary tumors, and it affects the immune system. Is this what we want to expose students and teachers to for 6 hours each school day? True or false? Radio frequency radiation is a possible human carcinogen. True. The World Health Organization classified radio frequency electromagnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic to humans. They based these conclusions on rat studies of people who use cell phones and on studies of people who live near cell phone antennas. In their press release, because they mentioned gliomas and wireless phones, some falsely believed that only cell phone radiation was potentially carcinogenic and that we didn't need to be concerned about other forms of radio frequency radiation. But this is not the case. Wi-Fi radiation is a possible human carcinogen.